Hello and welcome to the EMDR Maven podcast. I'm Julie Miller and I'm an EMDRIA approved basic and advanced EMDR trainer, an EMDR Institute regional trainer, and an EMDRIA approved consultant and certified EMDR therapist. I provide training through the EMDR Development Center, and you can learn more about that at the website emdrdevelopment.com. You can also check out all episodes of the podcast at emdrmaven.podbean.com. In each podcast, we'll have a question of the week to be discussed, and these can come from new and experienced EMDR therapists like you. We'll talk about a research study of particular interest in EMDR therapy, and we can talk about books, equipment, and ways to be creative to get EMDR therapy to work for your clients. I have advanced training information available through the EMDR Development Center website, emdrdevelopment.com. So send me your questions, your ideas, any resources you'd like to share with others, and any kind of request related to EMDR therapy so we can make this an interesting, fun, and educational time together. Let's get started. So I have a question from a relatively new EMDR person, just finished training, and they want to know about what do you do if the client is afraid of doing EMDR? It may be this fear comes up while you're orienting them to EMDR, or perhaps after they've done some reprocessing and they've become afraid, or they've just heard things about it and they're not sure that they want to do it. So let's just ask the client, so what's going on for you? What is it that's bringing up this concern? Or what's bringing up this fear that you have of EMDR? Now, what I've found is that if they've had EMDR before and they didn't like it, I want to find out what happened with that previous EMDR. Maybe there wasn't good fidelity, or maybe what they think was EMDR or the therapist told them was EMDR wasn't even close. So I want to find out what they did, what they didn't do. Maybe they got overwhelmed because they weren't adequately prepared, or the EMDR therapist didn't know how to handle the issues that were coming up for the client. Perhaps they were dissociative and the therapist missed that. That often happens, and that's something we've got to pay attention to in our preparation and reprocessing. If the client becomes dissociative, the wheels are definitely going to fall off. So we want to make sure that we're following up on any previous experiences and what happened. Was it helpful? Did it frighten you? What was going on in those sessions? And then I want to talk about how we might be able to do things differently. I usually reassure the client that we're going to be doing it properly, because I have a lot of years of training and a lot of years of experience. And for you, if you're new at this, you can say, I consult with folks who have a lot of experience, so I'll make sure that we can get this to work for you. Make sure that they're ready and they can take it at their own pace. That's what we really want to make sure the clients know, is we're going to go at your pace, not what we think you ought to be able to do, but really at your own pace. And then you do that. You slow down, you go at the pace the client can tolerate. Part of your rapport with the client means that you're going to have a good sense of their ability to be really frank with you. Are they honest about what's going on? Are they telling me what's coming up in those sets so that we can make sure that if something is coming up that they're not ready for or they don't want to talk about, that you know that and you can use container and other resources to help them set aside anything they're not ready to do. If they haven't had EMDR before and they're afraid of what it will be like, that's often about losing control, or I won't be able to handle it. And those might be things you want to look at and organizing a treatment plan. Like, when do you remember first feeling like you were losing control? Or when were you overwhelmed by something that was really intense? And in that case, we might want to start with working on some of those memories. The fear of losing control is a pretty normal human experience, but if someone can't do something that's perhaps in their best interest, like EMDR therapy, and it's holding them back, we want to take a look at where is that belief coming from? When have you experienced that before? And if we reprocess those experiences, then perhaps we can move a little further in. If they're adamantly opposed to doing any form of EMDR therapy processing, then we might actually want to take a look at something I use a lot when a client is ambivalent, which is the level of urge to avoid protocol. That's from Jim Knipe. It's in his book, EMDR Toolbox. It's also available in various places online. You can read about it. The level of urge to avoid protocol is also what Knipe calls his dysfunctional positive affect protocol. The steps, there's about 7 steps or so. The first thing I ask is, what's the image that represents what you want to avoid? The image is doing EMDR. So when you think about having a whole session in front of us and plenty of time to work on this fear of doing EMDR, how much on a 0 to 10 scale do you not want to think or talk about it? 0 is, I am fine with thinking about it or talking about it. And 10 is, I am so avoidant of this. I do not want to. I will not do it. So that's the 0 to 10 scale in this particular protocol. Where do you feel that in your body? Then just notice that feeling of not wanting to think about it or talk about it, and follow my fingers, or start the bilateral, you having them do it for themselves, or you're using equipment, or if it's online, asking them to start their own eye movements, or whatever you use for the online EMDR therapy. And then, of course, you're going to go through standard steps, like you notice a cue from the client, you say, take a breath. What do you get? And how much do you want to avoid it right now? 0 to 10. And just notice that and start another set of bilateral stimulation. So the level of urge to avoid should decrease, and the issue can be addressed with an appropriate protocol. At some point, you're going to be able to use standard protocol again and go back into regular EMDR reprocessing. If the level to avoid remains strong, there may be some hidden traumatic material, like a blocking belief or some event that they're very afraid that they might open up, and it may be conscious or subconscious. But we want to just kind of keep working at it. Using this level of urge to avoid protocol will often reduce anxiety about moving into reprocessing. If they're afraid, if they're ambivalent about it, this can be a helpful way to intervene. And again, it's clinical judgment on the therapist's part. The research article that I wanted to look at is from 2019. It is published in the Cognition and Emotion Journal, volume 34, issue 4, pages 656 through 669. And it is available online. It's by Mertens, Bowman, Asmarovic, and Engelhard. And it's called Changing Emotional, Visual, and Auditory Memories. Are modality-matched dual tasks more effective? And I've heard this before. There's speculation that if it's sound that's the worst part of a memory that you want to process, wouldn't you use auditory bilateral stimulation back and forth in the ears? Or maybe it's best, if the worst part of this memory is kinesthetic, that you use tapping. Or if it's the vividness of the picture, wouldn't you use eye movements? And so there's always been speculation, and I've heard people say, yes, I absolutely find that that is the case, that when I use eye movements, the image becomes less intense. And that's true. That's actually been demonstrated in research. But what about sounds? What about the kinesthetic or the body-related experiences that folks have when they think of a particular memory? So let's look at what this particular research says about that question. So from the abstract, it says clinical and executing a demanding dual task while recollecting emotional memories weakens the emotional intensity and vividness of these memories. Well, we all know that because that's essentially what EMDR therapy does. It's a dual task, dual attention, focusing on the memory, and then noticing this bilateral stimulation that takes place. And that reduces the intensity and vividness of the memories. According to multi-component working memory theories, which is what we think is most likely the primary effect of EMDR therapy is on the working memory, the effectiveness of dual tasks may be improved by loading specifically the same sensory modality of the emotional memories. And it says that so far, the evidence for this is really mixed. So in this study, they exposed participants to pictures of the International Affective Picture System database and then sounds from the International Affective Digital Sounds database. They create a single modality emotional memory, meaning they either have an auditory memory or a visual memory. And then using this design, the participants had to recollect their memories of the sounds and pictures while executing a visually demanding task, an auditory demanding task, or no task at all. And in this study, they found limited evidence for modality-specific effects of dual tasks on single modality emotional memories. So what this tells us is that what we have speculated about, or what many people have speculated about, is very limited in its potential as something useful with EMDR therapy. So you might think about that. I suspect, this is only my opinion and I'm not a researcher, but I suspect that given that we think the working memory theory is likely the most powerful thing that makes EMDR therapy work, the more modalities of dual attention stimulation or bilateral stimulation, the more modalities you use, the more likely you are to get that processing to work. So we try to hit on all the cylinders, perhaps. When I'm using EMDR therapy in person in the office, I'm usually using a light bar, headphones, and tactile tappers. When I'm online, I'm using often an app for the eye movements. They just follow a ball back and forth. And I'm also having them use headphones because the particular free app that I use, bilateral.io, is also able to provide auditory stimulation in sync. So it's limited in that the eye movements are only horizontal and the only auditory is in sync with the visual. So there's a lot of things that we can do to kind of mix things up with bilateral stimulation. One of them, of course, is to have a different direction of the bilateral. If you have a light bar, you can turn the light bar so it's diagonal. If you're using your hand, you can make your hand go diagonally. If you are using equipment and you can have the auditory separate from the visual so that the lights are going and it's on the left, while the tactile can be tapping on the right at the same time. If you could mismatch those things, I do find that that can often be helpful. There's a piece of EMDR equipment called the EMDR kit. I don't get paid anything for talking about these different kinds of equipment. The kit will allow you to have a faster tactile tapping than the light bar itself, because people can often move their eyes only so fast, and it's not that fast in most cases, but the tapping can be much faster. So it's not in sync and it's faster than their eye movements. So that can be another thing that you can use creatively to mix things up. And the more you load up the working memory, the more likely it is the processing will take place more quickly. At least that's what the theories say. I have found that to be the case for most people. For some people, it's really overwhelming. So you always have to use your clinical judgment in that. So in this case, what this research study is telling us is, well, there's really very little evidence to say that matching modalities to what the memory holds is probably not the real trick here. There's not much evidence to show that that's true, that you want to match the modality to the memory. What you really want to do is load up the working memory. That is a great research article. I like that. conclusion a lot, which is that it gives us room to be creative because we really want to find what works for the client. That's individualized, and that's a lot of your clinical judgment. Now, I want to talk a little about a resource that I like to use, and this is vertical eye movements. So vertical eye movements can be taught to your clients where you just have them across the room, looking across the room, they find a vertical line. It might be the corner of your office or the corner of their room. You want it to be top to bottom as far as you can, like from the floor to the ceiling, with them moving their eyes and not their head. So whatever that line might be, if it's following the side of their computer laptop and up a little bit and then back down to the computer laptop, that's fine. But you want them to find a vertical line. So dopamine, which is the feel-good hormone, is connected to eye movements. Dopamine itself isn't directly responsible for eye movements. It does influence neural pathways that influence them. So when you're using vertical eye movements, it tends to involve dopamine and affect your dopamine level. So if vertical eye movements are impaired, it can lead to disruption of those neural pathways that involve dopamine. Really encourage you to try this yourself as long as you're not driving, okay? But do this easy exercise. Notice what happens. There's often that feel-good hormone. The dopamine receptors are going to work a little bit more. So you might get a little bit more feel-good brain chemicals being released. So here's what you do. You just move your eyes up and down as far as you can go, following a straight line without moving your head, and just notice what happens. You don't have to do it for terribly long. Maybe just give yourself 5 or 10 passes and see what that's like. You don't have to go particularly slowly. You don't have to go particularly fast, but just notice what happens. For some of my clients, they have found it to do nothing. And I haven't done the research to find out why, but I do know that many clients will notice something happens. I notice something happens. So give it a try and see what you think. You might want to teach some of that to your clients because it may do a nice state change, again, for clients who need more than just one, and most of us do. See if that's helpful. So remember to send me your questions you have that you want answered on the podcast, consultation kinds of questions about the protocol or any specialized protocols. If I don't know it, I will go find someone who will. And that's when we have specialized guests on the podcast. We have some guests coming up in the next few weeks. We'll have someone talking about OCD. We'll have someone talking about couples work. We'll have someone talking about kids. And maybe even the use of EMDR with pregnant people. Hopefully, we'll have lots of good information coming up. Please do let me know your questions. You can send them to me at my email, which is jmiller4721@gmail.com. And I'll be happy to respond on the podcast. Just one last note, there's advanced training available through the EMDR Development Center, emdrdevelopment.com, and you can learn about EMDR addiction-focused protocols to help stabilize addiction and titrate trauma processing. If you're working with addiction clients, either substance or process addictions, I encourage you to take a look at this training because you're going to learn some things that will help you use EMDR in your addiction clients and also help stabilize that addiction so that they will then be later able to address the trauma that has been fueling their addiction. There's also a free class there about what to do when Calm Safe Place doesn't work. Until we talk again, take care of yourselves. Bye-bye.